I've known Mark for many, many years. He and my husband we were all great friends. And I guess if I have to describe one thing about Mark that I'll never forget, it was his laugh. Nobody could hear that laugh and not join in. It was infectious. It was full of glee. I mean, I know there were bad times, but he just always seemed to be, oh, what the heck? We're gonna make the best of this. You know, let's do this. He loved to be with young people, his nephews and nieces. He used to say, sometimes when I'd be going to something, you know, with my older friends, you don't want to go to older people. You want kids to keep you young. And I thought to myself, that is Peter Pan right there. And I have never, ever forgotten it. And I was just so sorry to learn of his illness. And Bill was good enough to let a few of us know that he wasn't doing well. And I thought, who's taking care of him? He was in that house all by himself. And I said, well, who's taking care of him? And he said, I don't know, I think a neighbor comes in. I said, I'm not gonna call him because I don't want to get him up where he has to get the phone. So I just sent him a card. And he wrote back. And this was when he was very, very sick. And we love him.
I think if Mark could speak to us right now, he'd say this is a stacked house. Of course, we know that with all these theater people, we are some of the toughest critics out there. He should have started with that story. Anyway, I worked with Mark in the 80s. He directed me in a number of shows, and I learned some things, and he helped me in some ways. One of the first shows I did, Princess Ida was mentioned, and Mark knew that I was kind of sweet on this young redhead in the cast. So he made sure in the opening scene that we were positioned on top of this bridge or this arch, doing our little bit of talking while the opening credits or the music was playing. And of course, my wife Janet might have objected to this, except that lady turned out to be my wife Janet. So we're very thankful to Mark for helping to move things along in that direction. A dispute did come up this week, however, about the archway or the bridge that we were on as to whether there was a moose mounted on it. Now, I can't say with 100% certainty from everyone else's perspective, but for Janet, there was a moose. For me, there was a moose. For us, there will always have been a moose. We'll have to check the tape. One of the first shows I did with Mark, I remember we had a rehearsal in the choir room at Middletown Presbyterian Church. And it's positioned above the ground, I'm not sure how high. But up to that point, I wasn't too terribly experienced. Now I am terribly experienced. But up to that point, my image of a director was the calm, sedate, and even hand that built the show over time. So we're waiting there at the beginning of rehearsal, just 3 or 4 of us, and all of a sudden, someone wheels around with this wild look, and I'm like, what? And I look out the window. There's Mark, his face peering over the bottom of the window. I don't know how he got up there, but he's got this wild glint in his eye, and that crazy smile and a stogie in his mouth. And we're all like both shocked and just doubled over with laughter at that point. I learned after that sometimes the most colorful characters are not what you see on stage. I also have to tell you, I learned that as much fun as it is to be up there performing, the bulk of the enjoyment I get out of production is the process of working with other people and experimenting and trying things and doing crazy stuff. Maybe it doesn't work, maybe it does. Building a really cohesive, wonderful show, or if not, hoping you have a cohesive, wonderful show, or maybe praying you have such a show. But that whole process is as much or more fun than the performance itself, and Mark taught me that. So I'm very thankful to him for all that he did, and I will always remember that wild glint in his eye, and I hope we can all enjoy everything we do in the future, keeping memories of him in our heart. Thank you.
They called me Janet because my maiden name is Lloyd, and maybe somebody can tell me who was Honey Lloyd, because to Mark, I was always Honey Lloyd. And we often talked about going back in our family trees and trying to figure out if we were really related. But his mother's maiden name was Lloyd. I believe that's what his cousin, who's taking the photo, told me. So.
Does anybody know
The First City Troop in February of 1974, and I am a proud understudy of Mark, who ran Skit Night. Whether he wanted to or not, he was the producer of Skit Night, which was an annual review parody of the 2 weeks of annual training. And it was generally after the first sergeant's dinner. We repaired to a barracks that had the place lined with tree limbs, and we were serious tree abusers in those days. And the stage was set. And once you finished cleaning your personal weapon and you were part of the show, you got to go to the barracks, help set it up, do the stagecraft, lighting, and we had a trunk that was huge that had all of that in that, including a sound system. Anyway, Mark was serious enough to have wanting to do markings on the floor where you were going to stand. And remember, this is after a lot of drinking too that this party can and we generally, well, at any rate, setting the party up, and Charlie McIlvaine, another dear trooper, as Mark was over here doing something, he was changing the markings on the floor. And then he'd sort of sit down quietly, and he was also the sump master. In other words, it was a bucket much like the Theta Xi. Worse, I won't go to the recipes. So you could sip a little, work a little, and then when he finally caught Charlie lifting up the table, Charlie had the grin like Mark's going, oops. Mark just went over, grabbed that sump, went over the window and pushed the wooden screen out. These are old World War II barracks. Threw the bucket out the window, and we could hear the ice crashing. And before he could say anything, somebody below said, "Send cups down." And Mark did. He took a sleeve of plastic, pushed it over. That's my marking term. Any rate, he said, "Now I've got your attention." And he ran this like a military operation. And they came off wonderfully. The lyrics, I was one of the recon elements that went to ask different vehicles, what has happened? Tell me something. So that we could period it. And as an understudy, my job, the first annual training had a weekend in between called Middle Weekend. And we went to, that was Captain Thompson's up in Fort Drum. And the writers and producers would hang around the swimming pool. And as an understudy, my first job was to run cocktails from the hospitality suite. And it was well lubricated, and they were having trouble. For some reason, maybe it was not a funny camp. But, so Mark suggested, let's pick a Broadway show. And somebody said South Pacific, and he said, no, it's now South Passaic. And it was just off to the races. That's got everybody, well, lubricated, but producing songs like Some Degenerate Evening, I'm sure you remember. Sitting on a 10th floor, drinking from a near empty sump. Oh shit, it's dawn again. That's how we started it. And then he'd ask you to sing, remember something from South Pacific, and then tear it up. We ruined a lot of Broadway. I should have danced all night. We remember that fondly. But at any rate, the other time Mark really helped me out, years later, I'm living in Manhattan, and I joined the Amateur Comedy Club, which was started in 1865 by the Steinway family. And at that time, John Steinway, the third or fifth, I don't remember, was president of the club, and a great guy. Claims to have been conceived under the stage at the Amateur Comedy Club. But as a new member, you had to produce, by the end of your first year, produce a major production. You could act or work backstage in minors. They had 3 minors and 2 majors every year. Well, I drew the short straw and ended up with one of the majors. And the thing that got me going on an idea, 2 things. One, Mark was a great mimicker of Groucho Marx. Between the cigar and the voice, he nailed it. So, and a relative of mine had edited a book of all the BOMOs of the Algonquin wits. The book was sold in their bookstore or in the lobby of Algonquin for years. So I took that and came up with A Night at the Algonquin. And the stage was, the whole club was a little bit bigger than this room. It was an old horse barn on Sniffen Court between Lex and Madison on 36th. Anyway, I got stuck. Smart guy here, bit off more than he could chew. And so I told Mark, and he said, what are you going to do? How do you have a lot of actors going to play each one of the wits? And I said, well, that's probably the least of the problem. And then I got the book, and he said, well, make it the damn, I forgot the room at the Algonquin where they hung out. So set the stage, instead of chairs like this, rented round tables, and he literally, I got credit for it, but I tried to give him his props. He said, do you want me to come up and do this for you? Because I was on the phone daily with him. And we got actors and actresses, and then guests. You were sitting there, and there's Dorothy Parker, and there's Benchley, and there's Groucho at each different table. And I said, well, how are we going to spotlight? We use spotlights. For God's sake. And it was kind of a hit. I got away with it thanks to Mark. So that's serious.
Younger cousin. I came here today, I was a little hesitant. My wife is here with me. She's better known as her extreme, overwhelming loveliness. In any case, I was hesitant because I was thinking I'm not going to know anybody here except maybe a few people, and several people did show up that I recognized and had the opportunity to say hello to. But while I was here, it became quite apparent how my life has really connected very much so with many of you. And I can reach back just to that comment that you made about Groucho Marx. Life is all relative. Of course, if you've ever met my relatives, it would be something Mark would say. And if you ever met Mark's relatives, it would be something to say, including myself. However, I just wanted to start off with saying, unfortunately, Mark's brother Gregory was not able to attend. He lives in California and wasn't able to get here for this event. He was aware of it, and he was about to get on a plane. I said, Craig, come on. We have a lot of other things to do regarding your brother's estate, and I'm sure that sometime he'll have the opportunity to get east here again and continue with that process. The things that I saw connected, as everyone was so generous in sharing their memories, I feel as though at some point I was the go-to guy for Mark. John, you mentioned that Mark was on Channel 6. I was the go-to guy for the one episode that he was writing, but he couldn't get an actor about the age I was to fill in for Anita on The World Around Us, and all of a sudden I get this phone call, hey, Mark, you want to be on television? And my mother goes, sure, he wants to be on television. So my Aunt Eleanor in her 1957 Eldorado Cadillac, who couldn't see over the steering wheel, drove me to Channel 6, and I was on television and got black and white pictures that I just came across a few weeks ago. Hi, Sam. Just like it back there. Again, another go-to moment in when I was a little bit older in college, I needed some work, and he had plenty of work to do, so I got to go down to 8th and Pine for an entire summer, commute down there, and I found that hard labor doesn't necessarily have to be in prison. Working down at his home on Pine Street, he wanted me to take off wallpaper. Well, I think the house was built in 1825, and there must have been 10 layers of wallpaper. I have an affinity to razors now, and trying to scrape wallpaper off. It was a painful, long summer, but I was employed. Then another summer came by. It was not summer, it was Christmas break. I was the go-to person. At the Pewtown Palaces, people might know the little apartment he was building behind his mother's house. It was affectionately known as the Pewtown Palace. Again, I was working in the dead of winter during winter break, and all I had was this heater that he had that would try to keep me warm. Didn't do too well. I remember being go-to person for Savoy. Mark, I guess he was a stage manager of one of the productions. I get this call, Mark, I need somebody to run lighting down at the Savoy. Oh, I don't know anything about running lighting. I'll teach you, come on down. So, again, I was doing lighting down at Savoy. And then as I got older and married and we had children, I went to several productions with my wife that Mark was involved with. And it was always a delight because you saw another side of Mark that we didn't normally see as a family. So it was quite enjoyable for that, to the point where at one point, I think it was, I don't know if it was Pirates or Yeoman, I think. Yeoman, we took my daughter and son along, and I think my son sort of got hooked on his, first of all, Mark's bravado, his animations, his humor, the way he expressed himself on stage. My son sort of got hooked on it. He actually went into theater when he went to college. So through that life, I was part of the thread that you were all part of the thread also. And for me, it was beautiful to experience the other side of Mark that we didn't always get to see, but at the same time, I had a connection with you now that I connected with regarding those wonderful experiences. Oh, by the way, Alfred, how many years was he working at your house?
From 1990 till 20.
That's about what it was at our house too. And if anybody wasn't aware of it, Mark is not a sailor. He had nothing to do with the Navy, but he could swear like a swell. There's words I didn't know that existed. But that was Mark's approach to working alone at your house. If things didn't go right, he was swearing to somebody. And in any case, we had 2 decks put on, stairway, flooring. It was quite a few years. He worked at our house also. To no further ado, we will all miss Mark. He was a delight in our life, delight for my children, and his memory will never be lost. Amen.